course, fought for us in Syria.
Spot on. Thank you for the intervention. I appreciate it, and absolutely it frames the ludicrous nature of seeking to, have a system that has the good refugee and the bad refugee. The reality is that if you create a second tier of refugee that the government sometimes refers to as illegal routes, brackets, there is no such thing as an illegal refugee. To refer to people as such is in contravention to international law and or international agreement on the matter. But absolutely, and I'll reel off a list of countries myself. Cameroon, Bangladesh, Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, Nigeria, Uganda. These are the most common countries of origin for people claiming asylum on the basis of their sexuality. They are also countries that have many individuals who are persecuted, of course, because of their sexual orientation, but they are not seen as areas of conflict or instability, and as such warrant no inclusion. They don't warrant inclusion on the UK resettlement scheme. And as the honourable gentleman just mentioned, as a result, those people will be treated as second-class asylum seekers. If they can find their way here, they'll probably find their way through very, very unsafe routes, though safer than staying put, I ought to add. Those fleeing those countries can therefore only come here by those so-called illegal routes, irregular, informal routes. It's also important to recognise that even if they were in a region where they could access the UK resettlement scheme, they may still remain at risk in neighbouring countries that they would pass through on the way to safety as a result of their sexuality, but which for other refugees might be places of safety. They would, of course, therefore obviously prefer to move onward to safety rather than wait in camps in an unsafe country, unsafe for them. Further to this, it is highly likely that LGBTQ plus communities, those people, will not feel safe coming forward and identifying themselves as a person who is eligible for resettlement, because it is quite possible, Mr. Sharma, that their families and communities could be the source of the persecution. And the government's choice to penalise further late production of evidence will clearly then disproportionately impact on LGBT people, and it is therefore obviously clearly wrong. Of course, there are reasons why, as the Honourable Member for Sheffield Hallam quite rightly set out, why LGBT plus people are less able to access safe routes to the UK than other categories of refugees. It's important, therefore, that refugees are treated the same, regardless of their method of travel. The conditions refugees are granted should not be dependent on how they reach the UK. There are many valid reasons why people have no choice but to use irregular routes. None of us want people to have to resort to using criminal gangs to access safety. Whether people do or don't, I'd happily give way.
Thank you. The honourable member's already mentioned Uganda. Uganda in 2014 passed an anti-homosexuality bill into law, which created a big outpouring of refugee communities. But the problem many of the Ugandan refugees had was that neighbouring countries, although their laws were not as strict as Uganda's, also they didn't want to identify themselves as LGBTQ. They did not want to have it known, and so actually their only option would be to come to a country like the UK, and so we do need to recognise that, as he's pointed out.
Yeah, the Honourable Member is absolutely right, and this is what's wrong with the bill. It sums up the problem of having this nonsense two-tier, immoral two-tier system. We don't want people to use criminal gangs to get here, but we have to recognise that if the government will not provide safe routes from these places, this is what people will have to do, and we should have compassion upon them. Irregular journeys and the fact that we are an island mean that people will travel through other countries before reaching the United Kingdom. Data shows us that most refugees remain in neighbouring countries, or indeed other European countries. Many take more asylum seekers per capita, of course, than the United Kingdom. The international refugee system relies on countries sharing the refugee population. We can't rely on certain countries because they just happen to be the first point of arrival in Europe, for example. To host all the refugees who reach them, it's not fair on Greece, on Italy, and so on. It just doesn't work. We need to do our bit. To treat certain kinds of refugee as second class or worse is wrong, and it is likely against international law. However, how can we look Putin in the eye at this terrible moment and challenge him over his breaches on international law when we are risking it and doing it ourselves, not just generally over having a second tier, a lower tier, a second division of less worthy refugees, but in particular the way in which we make life clearly much harder, demonstrably, for LGBTQ and other marginalised communities. That is wrong. The government must rethink.